Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you all here. My name is Jim Struve. I'm Executive Director of MenHealing, and I'm joined this afternoon by Dorn, who's co-director of our program evaluation project and on our facilitator team, and Richard Smith, who's our anti-racist consultant. We'll have a chance for each of us to introduce ourselves a little bit after the introduction here, but we have a tradition of starting all of our presentations with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to start by doing that. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations and ancestors who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn here to come from their distant homes. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. MenHealing and everyone here at the Script Conference are standing on ancestral lands of whatever tribes inhabited where they are before them. I'm talking here from Washington State, where the Lumi tribe was the previous ancestors. We pay respect to their elders past and present. As we begin this workshop presentation, we want to take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together for this time. So again, welcome. What we're going to focus on for the next hour, and then for the Q&A for those of you who come over, is we want to share with you MenHealing as just one example of an organization that is striving to incorporate social justice into all aspects of our work. And our mission is to provide healing resources for adult males who have been sexually victimized at whatever age. And we've learned that one of the things we have to do is service delivery that goes beyond trauma-informed work and best practice standards. And we have to have the importance of social justice as a key element of our work. So we're trying really hard to deal with that. The three of us bring different perspectives to our work. So hopefully we'll be able to add some depth and spirit to our conversation here. Our organization is built on transparency and honesty and vulnerability. So we really value the differences that we have between us. And in the talking today, what we want to really be clear to communicate is we're not giving the answers. We don't have the answers. We're in the process of what we're doing. And so we want to share so you can learn from us, and hopefully we can learn from all of you here as well. And our underlying goal is that we walk the talk, that basically everything that we are saying, we're also doing, and that we hold ourselves accountable for that. So the way we want to structure the afternoon is I want to have Dr. Deborah, who's one of our board members. We love being able to work together. It's so important to have her part of that. She's going to moderate, and we thought it would be more interesting for her to help facilitate a conversation between the three of us and her. And so she can start, and she'll lead us through the three of us being able to do a little bit more introduction of who we are. And thank you, Uma and Richard, for being part of this today.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah, I'm just turning to my page. You gave me this great script.
Okay, so thank you guys so much for being here today. And Jim, I'm going to brag about you because you're getting a Hope Award. And so you have to tune back in to see Jim get this beautiful award. Did you get yours in the mail already?
I got mine in the mail. Thank you very much.
Yes,
thank you
they are
much.
absolutely beautiful and very much deserved for education and training. And so Jim has asked me to moderate this great panel. And so the first thing we're going to do is go around and have you each introduce yourselves and what you do and how it relates to the theme.
I'll let you two go first, because we're trying not to be on a hierarchy.
I see Richard pushing the button, so.
Go ahead, Richard.
Go for it.
Hi everyone. My name is Richard Smith. Wow, what do I do? try to survive in a world that's filled with anti-Blackness, try to support the healing journey of other folks who are suffering under the brunt of oppression and white supremacy, and other forms of structural violence that have historically tried to, destroy us. And this is something that I came into just from my existence. And then once I got to a certain age in life, and when I was able to see that it wasn't just a coincidence that all of the Black and brown people around me were catching hell, and were suffering and were being exposed to things like police brutality, targeting, over-policing, mass incarceration, and all of the things that we know, unfortunately, plague communities of color. Once I realized that it wasn't a coincidence and that these things were happening systematically, and unfortunately for me, that realization came while I was in a cage, serving time in prison, as someone who had been impacted by mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. And it was there that I became radicalized and awakened to all of these other forces. And then also informed by men who unfortunately will never see the light of day. They were lifers, men who were serving life sentences, who had been in there. Some had been in there longer than I had been born. But they spent that time educating us younger men on what our true potential was and what our role was to fight for the liberation of Black and brown people, and to support the healing of Black and brown people. And since that radicalization and the release, my release from the cages of prison, I've worked tirelessly in any way possible to support young people who shared similar experiences as my own, of survivorship of various forms of abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, violence that's proximity. And I've done that work as program director for nonprofit organizations that serve young people and their families. I've also done it for organizations that work with formerly incarcerated people who return into the community after serving their time. And then more recently, I've done it for an organization. I did it for an organization called Common Justice that was working to advance healing equity for all historically marginalized people who had been impacted by various forms of oppression and systemic harm, providing technical support and training to organizations throughout the country who wanted to expand their healing services and their trauma support services to communities of color. And so, all of that to say that social justice is something that's just unfortunately an inherent part of my Blackness, to really exhaust energy, because it is exhausting, in order for us to gain some semblance of justice in a system that has been historically treated, has historically treated us unjustly. Yeah.
Thanks. I would say for me, my work really has also focused on really engaging in breaking down systems and really helping to dismantle white supremacy in many contexts. And I would say my journey, both in the personal and professional, has really come and rooted in me coming to the US when I was 10 from India, and that immigrant experience, and having parents who really struggled to make a life for themselves here in the US and feel like they belonged. And so a lot of my work is really focused on this idea of belonging. How do we create spaces of belonging through equity and access, right? And so for me, social justice really is focused in that work, in that how do we create economic, political, educational, legal, health systems, right, that really are equitable. So for me, I have worked in various contexts. I think when we work in systems that are rooted in white supremacy, oftentimes not feeling like belonging has been a constant probably experience. And so I have been in university settings teaching. I'm more recently just started at Antioch University at LA, and also doing some private practice and consulting around making organizations more focused on equity. And I think equity and belonging, right? If we aren't thinking about the things, if we just do this as a checkbox kind of thing, we're not making real sustainable change in creating organizations that allow for spaces for Brown and Black folks. So that's a little bit about me. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all. My work with MenHealing started off actually being on the board. I was on the board for a couple of years, and then hopped into the Facilitator Team because I really enjoyed kind of the direct service work and wanted to kind of be in there with the kind of the frontline kind of work. I also am involved with our program evaluation project, kind of helping to see how our program is effective and in what ways do we need to maybe shift or change it to make it more accessible for Brown and Black folks. So it's a little bit about me.
My journey is, I kind of guess, as I'm listening to Richard and Uma, what I would say is, having come from white privilege, growing up in an all-white community in a rural town, social justice has kept chasing me everywhere I go. So I went off to college with all the lofty goals of what a little white boy would do, only to be tear gassed within the first 6 weeks of being in school because I bumped into a demonstration that I didn't know was there. And it kind of radicalized me. And ever since then, I've been working on social justice issues, and I got really pulled in quickly at that being my life vocation. And along the way, accidentally got into social services just because I needed a job and needed money. And because of that, bumped into working with protective services. And because at the place I was, it was mostly a female staff, I ended up working with the boys who were victims. And from that experience in my late 20s, early 30s, realized that I had been abused all my childhood and had never, I just put it in a box, put it away, never remembered it again, didn't deal with it. So the latter part of my life now has been using my interest in social justice to address sexual violence. And along the way, I became a social worker just to pay the bills and to use social work and therapy as a vehicle for social change. And have been really excited to be working with organizations that are doing service at the national level for male survivors, especially since back in the 1980s. And so much fun being with a team where we all try to work together. And because I had some part of my life, I lived in communes and we did everything by consensus. I learned early on the real power of non-hierarchy, simple living, and collaboration. So that's part of the energy that I bring to our work. And briefly, just to say that I don't think we can end sexual violence unless we make social change that changes the world in which the sexual violence is occurring. So my struggle always as a therapist has been the individual nature or even the group nature of treating people that are just going to get spit back out and have to live in the same world that they came from. And so it feels like our organization being built on social justice is that balance that we have to provide. Otherwise, it just keeps going on and on and on. So we have to be change agents as well as service providers.
Okay, so here is our first question. Well, I think you answered some of it, but one of the questions is, what do we mean by social justice? Because it can mean a lot of things to different people, right? So let's expand on that. What does that mean?
I can take that. I think I did answer that a little bit in my response, but for me, it is that idea of equity across all of our systems that we're in, and to the extent that we're making, again, creating spaces where folks feel like they belong. And I feel like right now it's really focused on racial inequities, because I think that is at the root and the center of a lot of where our systems are broken. And I feel like if we can start to heal those racial inequities, we're going to address those other inequities that are also innately there. And so in addressing racial inequities, I think also thinking about it from an intersectional lens, right? And thinking about how do we create systems that are that are created for access in a way that helps people to get what they need in life, right? To be able to have a life that feels fulfilling and full. So for me, that's really how I view social justice. And social justice, again, I think can, in different contexts, I've heard it in religious contexts, in academic contexts, they do have it can be charged for folks. And so recognizing, like, what do we mean by that? And for me, it's like really engaging in work to dismantle systems of oppression.
I think what I would add to when I hear the term intersectionality, what I first think of around social justice is organizations that don't get siloed to put their energy into building their own domain of service, but where we really intentionally try to collaborate and share and build off the energies between people doing the work. I think so often even nonprofits get caught in the little track or their box, and then we end up potentially as organizations protect our own empire or getting caught in feuds between organizations. And I think we have to realize that all the crossing and intersectionality is about our energy for working together, and for organizations and individuals to be willing to be challenged around their blind spots so that we see how we might be perpetrating the issues that we're trying to correct, and be open to feedback and take in genuinely the willingness to change. Because I also think organizations or people doing the work can get stuck in our values or our procedures, and we don't see the need to change. And the last year has been such a good example how all the things that have gotten exposed, that have been right in front of us, right there. Some people were seeing them, but the culture now are seeing them. How do we not resist that, but we welcome that? And that exposure should not be threatening, but it should be embraced so that we can make those changes. And that's kind of the walking the talk stuff I mentioned before, is that we have to be open to that really social justice.
Is it that we were exposed, or that exposure made people listen? Because I think they were always there. I mean, the Aunt Jemima syrup was always there.
Right.
Right. Okay. So now we're seeing it and we're listening because of things that have happened. Right. So I think that that's the difference. But I'd love to hear from Richard, like what he thinks, because he has a look on his face like he's really thinking.
Yeah, it's so funny because like I was just on this webinar yesterday talking about healing justice, and how, just the commodification of these terms that come up that have these like very nuanced, complex, academic, context that oftentimes makes it inaccessible for average folks to understand it, to the point where it's something that's like people get so confused by it that they don't even know that they're doing it when they're doing it. And for me, like, just simply put, like, social justice work is just, it acknowledges, first it starts, my thought is that it starts with an acknowledgement or an awareness of the inequities and injustices that exist in our society, right? And we can talk about how they're interrelated or intersectionality, but then it also leads to a sense of solidarity and action and a commitment to play any role that you possibly can to try to bring about more justice and equity. And if you're doing it as an academic, helping people become aware and raising their consciousness. If you're on the front lines as an organizer, trying to get the people out there to raise hell, to put pressure on policy levers on people who have the power and have been abusing their power and perpetuating the inequities, whether you're a social worker who is working directly with someone who's been impacted, but also simultaneously keeping that lens and that perspective in mind. So not to just solely focus on the individual, but be aware of all of those systemic factors, those systems of oppression and inequities and injustices that like contribute, and in my belief, you know, my opinion, cause some of the behaviors that you're trying to support. And so I think it's just really just like, simply, it's just like, just being aware that there's inequity. And I think that's what happened just recently, right? I think, you know, there are people who were directly impacted who knew that the inequities were existing, that it existed, they lived it, right? People, Black people, brown people were not just made aware of police brutality over the last 10 years. We've been talking about this forever, right? It's just unfortunate that, you know, it took a ton of research, mostly led by white researchers to like validate the complaints that we made, you know, about driving while Black in order for it to become an issue. And then it became an issue and something that we were able to focus on intellectually and kind of educate people on. And then we kind of got stuck there. And then, you know, it came to a point and now the people took to the streets and said, you know, enough intellectualizing and talking about this shit. Like, what are we going to do to change it? What does action look like? What does direct action look like? So.
Yeah, and I think that sets the stage really well. And you guys have all set the stage for this next question, because it is, how do organizational approaches for MenHealing intentionally seek to shift power dynamics?
Well, a couple of things that we've done since forming as an organization that I think contribute to it, that are available really for any organization to do, is one is we are trying to make sure that everything we do is done with intention or conscious awareness, so that we want to have informed decision-making, informed actions. And then we are also trying to build everything around transparency, so that we're not one of those organizations where people are surprised to find out what happens behind the closed doors, and the public as well. And third, the building block is the non-hierarchy. We have been successful at our board, and our staff team are doing the same kinds of work. We're working on the same issues, doing the same kind of growth in parallel, and there's cross communication. Every year we have a joint board facilitator meeting. We keep close communication. I know a lot of organizations, and even many people on our team, have been in place where they never even met the board before, and where the board never has met the staff. And we have where it's full engagement between everybody. We, as much as, well, not as much, we make all of our decisions around consensus. We're not a parliamentary organization. Our team, our staff, our board operate by consensus. So those are just a few things that we do. And then we try to build an equity, whether it's gender, race, sexual orientation, as much as we can, so that there's not differential treatment for people based on those categories. And because we're a low budget organization, we've been able to have financial equity too, which is mostly volunteer. But we're hoping that as we grow, that we maintain equity in whatever kind of financial payments emerge as we get bigger.
I think to add to that, I have really appreciated kind of the process of soliciting and using feedback from whether it's the team or the staff, you know, the board. I mean, we just are really great about being growth oriented, or having that growth mindset of like, we are going to continually evolve, where we haven't arrived. We will keep moving through that process. So in that, along with that transparency, there's this real clear understanding of like, we want feedback, and we want to ask for more information so that we can do it better. And so, I mean, and one way that I think I've been specifically involved in is that we, very early in terms of, our organization, just have solicited feedback from participants and then using those feedback back. So it's like, we use it to restructure our programming or include things or making it more accessible and available for folks. But we're doing that like an ongoing basis. And it's not just this like one-time kind of thing, but that we have had that at the center of kind of our work that we've done. So I've really appreciated that there's this like, there's not this like, I have to wait for a survey to offer feedback, that that's just part of the process. We just have that ingrained in the work that we do, which I love.
And how does that relate to your core values? And how does all of that relate to social justice work?
Well, I think having core values is the first step, because it's been kind of interesting that this is the first time actually that I've ever been part of an organization where there was enthusiastic emphasis on figuring out what our core values were and making them transparent to ourselves and the public. So the core values that we've had is intentionality, transparency, integrity, self-care, relationship. And what we've even been talking about now, this is kind of even new with Uma and Richard, but we've been beginning to process with the board, having our program evaluation project should have a component where they hold us accountable and they do review and evaluation so that we catch any departure or wavering from our core values, because it would be easy to chase the money or chase the power or chase the whatever it is. And we really need to have some internal function that means that the values are not just on paper, not just for show, but that defines. And I think what I'm hoping it does is it means we're an organization that has a soul and a conscience. And we're not just about service delivery, but we have a soul and a conscience as well.
I'm curious because I know that Richard's working as a consultant, for you in this way. And, one of the questions we have here is, how does doing all of this address an anti-racism, atmosphere and relate to your mission and vision? But I'm wondering, how Richard's guiding you in that. So how is that occurring? You know what I mean? I'm just curious about that.
Richard, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll add something to that. I mean, you can chime in. But one of the things I'll add before even just, focusing on anti-racism is that I've been fortunate to work with a lot of organizations. And one of the things that was really obvious to me was the commitment to not only just thinking about sexual abuse on an individual level, but like being able to contextualize it within a larger power, racial framework, right? And being aware of, as we said earlier, the overlapping and the ways in which certain identities, certain groups, their experience of sexual abuse is exacerbated by those other forces, by racism, white supremacy, mass incarceration. And so that's something that was really obvious and something that stood out to me when I first started having conversations with Jim, connecting with other folks on the staff. We had a retreat that I was able to participate in that was something that really stood out, right? And also creating a space in which people could speak very transparently about their experiences and their concerns was something that was really unique as well, specifically as it related to race, as it related to gender. So those are things that I found that like were really good, that were in place. Some of the things that we're thinking about now is like how to become more intentional with that, thinking of not just an awareness of the role that these other things play, these other forces play in the experience of sexual abuse, but how to potentially collaborate or advocate in ways that brings that awareness to other folks who do this work, but also keeping that in mind as the work is being done. I think that's something that, that Bruce is really, that Jim is really intentional about, and everyone that I've spoken to is intentional about. I think the other thing is really recognizing that their services needs to be extended and expanded to be more accessible to men of color, and really being honest and humble about how to approach engaging and making that happen and what that looks like, and being open to receiving feedback in a way that it can increase the likelihood of that happening without trying to put any limitations. Because I think sometimes folks, organizations may want feedback, but when they get that feedback, they pick and choose what aspects of the feedback they want to incorporate into the work that they're doing. And it seems like, thus far, like everyone is really open to receiving it in a way that is presented and honoring it. So one of the things that we're working on now is doing these listening groups to hear from men of color who are providing support services to survivors who may not specifically be supporting survivors of sexual abuse, but understanding that it's prevalent among the population of men of color that they're working with, and how to get that information from them, how to figure out how to, support and collaborate with them in any way that it comes up, and honoring that. So those are just some things.
I would say from my experience, when I started on the board, I feel like we've been talking about this. We've been talking about reaching communities of color and really engaging in this work. And in some ways, I think, in our intentionality probably there's been a little bit of fear of stepping into this work and making mistakes or doing harm and those kinds of things. And I think that's where really at this point, I think we're at the point of like, we're ready to do this work, but really need a space where we're invited into the space, right? And I think the other part of it is the way our program has been structured. A lot of it has been around waiting for people to come to us. And we know when we are trying to work in communities of color, we need to, that's a model that doesn't work. And so really kind of how do we come to them with the invitation from them, right? It's both, right? We don't just show up. We've got to make sure that we are wanted and needed. And so I think the big piece of this is Richard, helping us to figure out what that means and whether we're wanted and needed, and what does that mean for us to be in that space. And so I think that's where it's been really helpful to do that.
Yeah.
Can I add one? Oh, also.
No, go ahead. This is your
I was going to say, and another big thing too that I missed is that that is also very, important is the work that's being done internally, right? So the work to address the ways in which, folks on the team have, white folks have, their privilege, have internalized racist views and so forth, and really being committed to that, because, the last thing you want to do is you want to invite people in and then they encounter situations that could be potentially harmful.
Right.
And so the work that's being done, to counter that internally and preparation has been, I think that's been, it's a unique process that I haven't seen many organizations, especially organizations that are mostly, have mostly white folks and white leadership.
Yeah, I was gonna build on that if I can, Deborah, first.
That was the question I was going to ask you. So go ahead.
For those who don't know, the Weekend to Recovery started back in 2001, and we were under the leadership of another organization at the time, and we became MenHealing at the end of 2017. When we made the formation, till that point, we had been predominantly a white staff with a white board and a white organization. And we made the commitment that the first thing we had to do is, in a genuine, not a showcase kind of way, in a genuine way, change that. So we now, at this point in time today, have 2/3 of our board are now people of color. And if we bring on a new person that we're interviewing, we'll be 70% people of color on our board. Our staff has moved from all white to, we now have 1/3 of the team are people of color. And the white members of our team have formed a white accountability group and have been meeting monthly for over a year with 100% attendance and doing it willingly to do it. So I think those are things that we've really done, and we realize that we have to do the work ourselves before we can have any sense of credibility to go out and even try to do the work. Now what we're doing, where Richard's going to be very key to us, is that how do we not become a liberal mixed orientation, mixed race organization that becomes missionaries instead of engaging in the people that we do. And then lastly, our whole existence has been built on the flagship of our core program, which is the Weekends of Recovery. And now it's come to our attention that maybe the core premise of our flagship program is a white supremacist orientation. People come to us and pay money, et cetera, et cetera. And so what do we do as an organization? Do we dismantle our flagship identity? Do we throw it out, start over, tweak it? Well, we do. But we're all in the middle of it in a very willing and almost excited, energized way to think about what are we going to do and change that, rather than circling our wagons to try to rebrand or refashion. But I think that has application to other organizations that may be caught in the same kind of dilemmas. As your awareness and your blind spots become exposed, it could be right at the core of who you are and how you're structured.
Yeah, I actually was going to ask you, how are you attempting to challenge the norms of the white supremacist service model? So you're kind of answered that question. Yeah. So I, am going to take it further, and I want to ask, in what ways does MenHealing engage in critical analysis to maintain a moral and ethical compass? Because there are a lot of things that can twist and turn in this, especially in leadership, in organization, with yourself, with the people coming in. Like, you said, they come to us. Well, now you got to go to them, but it's a different community. How do you balance where to go, and what's the best way to go about that? And are you still being oppressive in that way? Like, how are you doing that?
I think the big part is accountability. And I think we're going to have to kind of keep coming back to that in some way. And really, to the extent that we are, creating structures and processes that allow us to be accountable to each other and accountable to our board, like really being thoughtful. And I even like having Richard on, I really feel like kind of serves in that role in some way. We're not just kind of saying, hey, yep, here's our idea that's worked really well, and we're going to keep doing it, so for me, I think going back to kind of our core values around transparency and intentionality, and making sure we are, I feel like even as we're thinking about where our programming shift is happening in our last meeting, just how Jim will bring it back to us and say, here's what I'm considering. What do you all think about that? And kind of really getting a sense of like, how will this impact? And one thing I will say, even though we, and have 1/3 of our facilitator team as folks of color, I still feel like my voice is just as heard. And like, I don't feel like that piece where I can be in the minority voice, but have the same level of power, if that makes sense. And so, and in many ways that has been really helpful. And I think not being driven by external maybe, gains for this. I mean, we've been really intentional about funding sources and who do we get that from? And what does that mean in terms of whether we would have to shift our work where it doesn't meet what the community needs because of what we might end up having to do. So really being thoughtful and intentional about kind of what we take on and learning to kind of say no to some things, or, really kind of being curious to make sure we are ultimately coming in to serve the community, and being accountable to making sure we are doing that in the best way possible.
Something else that we're doing very vocally, and I'm really excited about, we'll see where it's going. I think we have pretty much consensus, but we realized that the other thing is that the service work we were doing really grew out of mostly mental health clinicians who came together to do this work. So therefore we were doing it under the rubric of status quo mental health and all the systemic issues that come with that. And we're now naming and labeling very without apologies that the mental health system is white supremacist in its core, in its model. And that there's so many weak points and bias in trauma-informed therapy, evidence-based therapy, based on populations that don't represent certain people. And so we have to challenge being in that bubble of white supremacist mental health and free ourselves and do things like challenge the diagnostic model, the way in which people are pathologized for the trauma experience that they have, the way that people are mistreated because of the economics that our system is built on. And that again, as a service organization, we have to be participants in challenging that system and see how we can develop models where we don't take money or take the road that goes down that path, because we're doing the service delivery based on that. And that I hope we can stay really active as a player that challenges and be very loud and vocal advocates for changing that whole system. Because otherwise, anything we're going to do to end sexual violence is just the revolving door.
So I'm curious, because I'm on your board and I know we put in a lot of sweat equity into it, and it's a labor of love, right? But how do you decide what to pursue and what opportunities to say no and what opportunities to say yes? Because I know I struggle with that, because you want to do everything because you're like, oh, it could be an opportunity. Oh, well, this money, could help. But then do you want to be connected to that organization, right? Does it go against what you're trying to do right now? How do you decide that? What's your process? And, just elaborate.
Well, that's partly what I want the program evaluation committee to be more active to tweak and evaluate that. Just an example of where we do, and I guess I'm kind of in the core of this currently because of my position as executive director. We were approached and realized there was a source of government money coming down the pike, and that someone was going to help us get a grant and help us write. So we were meeting, my board chair and myself were meeting with the people to help teach us or work with us to make sure that we could get the money. And as we were sitting there through a couple of meetings, we realized bureaucracy, administration, all the tweaking, and we just started seeing how we were going to get bled dry by having to do the oversight and the management. And here we are, an organization that doesn't have a lot of money, and this would have been a pretty much influence. And we said, no, thank you. I think we'll stay on the course that we're on, and we won't go this route with the grant, and we'll figure out something else to do. So I hope we stay willing to turn down those kind of examples, because I think they're traps, not opportunities. And Uma and Richard, I don't know if you have more to say. I was just thinking that is one example that I've been in the middle of, is turning down. And the other is to be grassroots financially supported. So if we can have as many grassroots supporters, then we can free ourselves from being funded by people that have their agenda that they want us to carry out.
I've also noticed just like the emphasis on consensus and transparency and that type of decision-making process. I can't keep up with Jim's emails. Like, it's always like something about consensus or accountability. I'm like, but it really is truly, you know, it's special to see that, you know, that there's this constant check-in in a way that empowers folks and gives folks voice and decision-making processes that's pretty unique. You know, the other thing that comes to mind, and I just think about, you know, just, you know, the focus on just not being empire builders, but movement builders too, right? Not just trying to exalt MenHealing as the, you know, the pinnacle, as the premier organization, right? It's something that also speaks to the soul of MenHealing in a way that creates the groundwork and the soil for all of these other, for all the other work, the anti-racism work, the equity work, you know, the social justice work to be planted. And because that soul in itself allows for that other work to take place. So that's something that I appreciate. And I know I'm like talking about it as a MenHealing as a fan, but you know.
That's okay. I'm a fan. I'm telling you, you know, the organization in Jim won me over. When I first started, I was like, what is this? No, these people can't be for real. That was what was in my head. And then they got in my heart, right? And I would never leave MenHealing as long as they have me, because their mission and their vision, they're the real deal. You know, and you very rarely can say that about an organization that really walks the walk and talks the talks and has checks and balances. They're the real deal. You know, I mean, just sitting here being this vulnerable in a conference, talking about how they're trying to work on white supremacy with a bunch of people of color, like, come on now. They're the real deal.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, right, as I'm just, you know, just taking into consideration, like, folks in the audience, like how this lands, right? Because you know, I'm sure folks are sitting in the audience at their respective organizations and just like curious, right? You know, and that's what we're hoping from this presentation, to like, you know, share the experiences of MenHealing in a way that can generate ideas. But it's not easy to make these decisions. It requires a tremendous amount of courage. And yeah, and it's in like Jim repeatedly said, and Uma repeatedly said, that they're not heavily funded. And so, you know, that's some of the, you know, that's some of the smacking on the wrist you get when you want to go against the grain in the way that they do. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, that it's, you know, folks are sitting and they're thinking about it in that way at their respective organizations, and even feeling overwhelmed about like, damn, what do I do now after I get all of these ideas and I hear about this work that's being done in a way that doesn't, because, you know, we can also internalize and be like, damn, am I not stepping up, right? You know, thanks, you know, thanks for making me feel like shit. You know, I'm trying to, because y'all are so great. But really just putting it out there that this is not easy and it's extremely challenging. And more importantly, like, that's why we're sharing as a way of offering and some support through that. Right, Jim?
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, back to the question about moral and ethical compass, part of what I'm hopefully bringing to this experience from my communal background is twofold. One is that how do we get an organization that becomes very powerful, very much in the throes of making really significant change, and we stay simple? How do we keep simplicity in an organizational fashion? Because that's, again, one of the things that was so powerful for me was learning how to live with simplicity, learning how to live where it wasn't controlled by how much any of us had. And whenever, what we did in the commune was whoever got a job that paid more, it went in the hopper, the same as people who weren't making that. And then we all came out the other end getting the equal amount to have for our resources. And we shared as much as we could. I'm hoping that's the kind of organization we can be, is one where we have some that way. And then the second part of it is how it doesn't get ego-based, where someone becomes the star, and we try to make sure that everybody shines. And that what we want to do is for people to have this unified sense of belonging and being part of an organization where our commitment is really honestly heartfelt and rewarded. And it's not about money, it's not about title. And I think that's hard for organizations to do. I'm hoping that we're going to keep on the path as we get bigger of modeling how that works. One of the things I say about our weekends with our facilitators, I emphasize to the team, the most powerful weekend is when we go into a weekend, 6 of our staff, 28 men, and we do a weekend and people forget that we were there. And they don't necessarily even remember our name. They remember where we are, how to find us, but it's not like we were the ones that they worship as they're going out the door. That to me is a powerful organization.
Yeah, and that brings me to our last question, because then we have to move on to the Q&A and wrapping up. But how do you balance your individual service work with the organization? You know, because that has to be a balance. You don't want ego, but you know, Jim, you do have star power. I just got to let you know. But how do you balance all that to create this space that is so safe?
Well, see, just what I want to always practice humility as a core value. That's really what I say. Humility in my finances, humility in my role, humility in my leadership. And every time I have some, even like a compliment like that, whatever star power I have is because of the people who are together with me.
I knew you'd say that.
That's where the star power is. And I want to keep that as a core value.
And I would add to that, I think because Jim is generous in his star power, that he brings on people that have their own star power, right? You know, like I really think that it then spreads. And so in many ways that intentionality is also intentional on, you know, who's on the team, who's on the board. I mean, we are all, I mean, there is not, I never at one time go, oh, someone's not doing what they need to do. Like people are there and they're all in it completely, which is really unusual. I have been in many organizations and that is unusual, right? Yeah. I don't have that, you know, so I think that there's some intentionality around that. The other piece of that is I think there's also this like room for us to mess up. Like we are going to mess up. And that is completely part of the process, that this work is messy, especially when we're doing anti-racist work. And so I think allowing space for the messiness and not being quick to clean it up, but to sit in it, you know, and then allowing that to be part of the process. I think those have been really instrumental in this work.
On that, we have about 2 minutes left.
Richard, do you want to have closing comments?
Oh, well, I just wanted to add something about that, about equality and also about ego. And it's something that I've come across quite a bit, right? And this is specifically as it relates to Black and brown folks and folks who have been denied access, right? And also haven't been seen or considered valuable. And the understanding that some of that ego is a trauma response to that historical oppression and that historical denial. And it doesn't mean, and it's not showing up as ego in a way, you know, is necessarily greed, in my opinion. It's showing up as a response to the historical denial of their value and their existence, to the extent that you find yourself trying to overcompensate, right? You know, I was just talking to a friend about, like, you know, the lesson when I first started my doctoral program. I was in a room with all of the other faculty of color, and they sat me down and told me, and Black and brown folks on this call probably have heard this before, you got to work twice as hard as your white counterparts, right, to show yourself approved. And so there's part of that is a trauma response too. And I don't want people to like say, oh, look at, you know, Rakeem trying to show off and show out. some of that is related to that historical denial of our value and our existence that shows up in ways that may just present as ego, but it's really like a survival mechanism, right, to affirm us. And then in all other spaces, right, because once you leave out of the academy, where you have your PhD and people acknowledge your credibility, that you work twice as hard to be able to, get the recognition from your colleagues and your peers. Once you leave out of there, you're just a Black person and people don't see the PhD. So yes, we might be a little bit more flamboyant. Yes, the car might look a little bit different, but those are certain things that we've learned to do, I think, as an effort to try to affirm us and get the recognition we need. And I don't think that should be labeled as anything pathological, but as a survival mechanism.
Right.
Thank you so much. That just like solely summed it up. We are going to go on into the Q&A room. Devon, which one are we supposed to go into? Because we can continue this discussion there, and there's a lot of things in the chat that we can answer questions for. So please, let's move on in there.